looked last week at the Ethiopian Bible, and we saw that one ancient Christian tradition uses a much broader canon. And tonight we're going to look at one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how it not only gives us a remarkable window into the Hebrew Bible as it existed long before the events of the New Testament, but also kind of a look at this kind of ancient Hebrew group, the sect of Judaism that we're pretty sure are the ones who collected and copied all these manuscripts that we have, or they found. But we'll start with what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? And they are a collection of roughly 900 to 1,000 ancient Jewish manuscripts discovered between 1947 and 1956 in 11 caves near Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. That's why they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they were found there. Number one on our fill in the blank is the Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of roughly how many ancient Jewish manuscripts?
Say that again?
900 to 1,000, around in there. And one of the handouts is the infographic from Wesley Huff. It was all pretty and colored, but I had to black and white it so we could print it. Anyhow, he has 970 scrolls is what they believe they have. But again, it's kind of a up in the air thing because of the state of what they found, which we'll get into here in a bit. But they are mostly written in Hebrew, with many in Aramaic and a few in Greek. They date from about 250 BC to AD 68, making them roughly 1,000 years older than the manuscripts that were previously thought to be the oldest copies of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, of course, as those of Judaism would see them as. So number two there is most of the scrolls date from about 250 BC to AD 68. Roughly how many years older than the manuscripts? 1,000, exactly, 1,000 years.
Would these be the original?
No, not the originals. But, and that's the whole thing of it there, is that, just kind of shows, I guess, the deference that they had in copying them from that point to when they did the Masoretic text. You remember we talked about that in later on, about how closely they match, and can assume before that they did the same, but really don't know. All the original stuff didn't survive or hasn't been found, and probably hadn't been found because it didn't survive because how old it'd be.
But it could be they're the ones in the Ark. Is that the ones in the Ark?
The Ark of the Covenant?
Yes.
That would have been, I think, it's the Ten Commandments. There might have been a copy of the stuff Moses did there. I know they had different stuff. They were supposed to be like the kings of Israel were supposed to copy down like either all the books of Moses or maybe just Deuteronomy. I'm not sure.
Somebody had made a comment that they might be in heaven.
Yeah, it could be. It's a big question about where the Ark is and whatever happened to it, and the stuff that was inside there as well. So, the question is the discovery of the Ark, of these scrolls, and who hid them. And there's various stories, but they all kind of revolve around these basic facts here. That in late 1946 or early 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Adib, which I think means like the wolf, so I don't know about that. But anyhow, along with his cousin Juma, they were tending goats near the Dead Sea. One version of the story says that one of the goats got lost. He was trying to find it, and he saw these caves, so he just kind of chucked a rock in, hoping if the goat was in there, it'd scare it out. But instead, he heard a pottery break. So they investigated, and they found all these clay jars containing ancient scrolls. So, number three on our questions there is the first scrolls were discovered in 1947 by a young Bedouin shepherd boy near the ancient settlement of where?
You didn't tell us that.
You didn't tell us.
Well, I said that earlier. You got to keep a little bit of memory going on here.
Oh,
They,
no, I'm lost.
they were found in 11 caves near Qumran.
I don't know.
Qumran.
Okay, I found it on the map.
Yeah, it's also on the map there. Yeah,
Next one I'll tell you how to spell it.
there's little.
And you know, when I saw that, I actually Googled it. Because 1947 sounds too recent for something that ancient to be found.
Well, yeah, that's why it was such a big deal, and why, as we'll see, that there's a lot of problems, or not problems, there's a lot of like just fragments. They didn't find just like all these perfect scrolls. They found fragments of a lot of it, and some stuff they found that was whole is like even more special. And basically, the Bedouins eventually sold the first 7 intact scrolls to 2 different antiquity dealers in Bethlehem. These scrolls eventually made their way to scholars and has sparked the worldwide interest. And as I understand it, they sold them for like $100. But that was the thing. They went in and found, they like grabbed like the ones that looked the best, that they thought they could maybe get some money out of. But anyhow, over the next decade, thousands more fragments were found. The people who lived at Qumran and hid the scrolls were very likely the Essenes. They were a strict separatist Jewish sect. However, that's not 100% proven. Some scholars believe they were the Essenes, but some think the scrolls might have all came from the Jerusalem libraries that were hidden as the Romans approached in AD 68. There's also others who believe that maybe there's I can't think what the term is now, but there was a law that if something, any scripture had God's name in it, that you couldn't just throw it away. So even if it became damaged or worn out, you had to like basically preserve it, keep it somewhere. And they thought this might have been like a dumping ground for those types of sacred texts that had been basically had lived, like served their life span or whatever. But there's problems with that because there's so many different non-religious texts there that it wouldn't make sense they'd have a mixture of those different things.
I know it's probably on here somewhere, but what were these made out of?
They're made mostly of sheepskin, but there were some other things which also is like a questionable type of deal, which is why they thought maybe it was this hiding place for sacred text, a dumping ground essentially, because there were some that were made out of cowhide, and they're not, you can't raise cows in that area. So they thought, well, they must have came from all over the place. If this ever comes up. But anyhow, yeah, they were basically
I just
that.
because they had to keep it from deteriorating somehow.
Yeah, well, basically, the reason they were kind of kept from deteriorating mostly is the location, very dry and arid in the desert there. Of course, they were in these caves. They were kind of out of the elements, and they were also in these clay jars. So they weren't just like laying out someplace, and they weren't getting wet, and that. So that, like, all that helped preserve them. Yeah, it helped preserve them, And it's doubtful that the people who did put them there thought they'd be there for, 2,000 years before they were found. But that may never come up. But we'll follow up with that. Again, number 4, the people who lived at Qumran and hid the scrolls were most certainly the who? The Essenes. Yes, a strict Jewish separatist group, the Essenes. Essenes. I have a typo on my thing there.
Are they still?
No.
Okay.
I don't believe so. And part of that's probably just what they believed. Because a lot of them were like celibate, so they didn't reproduce necessarily. But that's questionable too. So who were the Essenes? So during the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that intertestamental period, 3 main Jewish groups emerged. This is basically during the time of the Maccabees. We talked about like the first, second Maccabees, and the Hasmodeans. Those are the Maccabees when they started to rule themselves. They were called the Hasmodeans. The there's three different groups. There were the Pharisees that we hear so much about in the New Testament. They were teachers who emphasized both the written law and their oral traditions. And they were basically common folk or lay folk, eventually, but they were just really, strict about things. Or so you thought. Then there were the Sadducees. They were the wealthy priest class who accepted only the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses there, and they rejected the idea of resurrection. We see them a little bit in the New Testament, and particularly the fact that they rejected the New Testament. They came and asked Jesus some kind of, weird question that they'd concocted. And then there's this other group. They were the Essenes, and they were actually the strictest of the three. So when we see the Pharisees, we always think, oh, they're so strict. But like the Pharisees or the Essenes, it's like those guys aren't even serious. If they were serious, they'd be like we are. But they believed that the temple and the religious leaders had become corrupt, and that, of course, started with the Hasmoneans, because the Maccabeans, and that they actually were kings and also high priests. And they said, well, that's not right. But they also, then later on, they thought all kind of stuff was corrupt. But, so they withdrew into the wilderness, lived in strict purity, and waited for God to act. The people who hid the Dead Scrolls, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, were most certainly the Essenes. So, number 5. During the time between the Old and New Testaments, 3 main Jewish groups were emerged: the Pharisees, the Who, and the Essenes. Sadducees. There you go. Now, the Essenes used a special method of interpreting prophecy called Pesher. And they believed many Old Testament prophecies were being fulfilled in their own time. Specifically about their leader, who is never named, but he's called the teacher of righteousness, and their enemies. The teacher of righteousness was the founding leader of the Essene community that hid the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls never give his name, but they describe him as a priest who received special revelation from God, and he led this strict separatist group that believed the temple and everything in Jerusalem had been corrupt, and even the calendar had been corrupt, according to them. But yeah, he's the teacher of righteousness is one of the most important figures in the story of the scrolls, even though we don't know who he actually was. And the Essenes followed a 365-day solar calendar. They got that from the book of Enoch and Jubilees, which they considered to be on par with Scripture. They actually believed that Enoch wrote the book of Enoch and gave it to Noah. He maintained it on the ark, gave it, down through the line, and was, kept until whenever. And also the book of Jubilees, they believed that that was given to Moses. I don't know if on Sinai or just where, but given to Moses directly from God or from an angel. And so anyhow, instead of that traditional lunar calendar that we see prescribed in the Bible and that was used in the temple, the Torah commands feast on specific dates in the lunar calendar, right? It'd be like a new moon, and then you count so many days, and then you have Passover, and all the feasts basically revolve around something with like the new moon, and then counting so many days, and then counting so many days from that, and on and on. But they thought that that was wrong. It had been corrupted and fallen out of sync, because when you do that, sometimes the feast days end up on the Sabbath. And so it's like, well, that can't be. You can't be doing the feast stuff on the Sabbath. So they have this 365-day calendar, and when they use that, every festival always fell on the same weekday, I think on a Wednesday or something. Or at least each festival fell on certain days, but never on the Sabbath. So they saw this as being more faithful to the Torah, even though it says to use the lunar calendar, instead of being less faithful. They also believed they were living in the end days, and that a major war between good and evil was coming. Now there's this Dr. Jonathan Cline. He is a respected scholar of ancient Judaism at Boston University. He says, basically kind of joked, that the Essenes were the Calvinists of Second Temple Judaism due to their belief in determinism. Josephus says about the Essenes, the sect of the Essenes affirm that fate is the mistress of all things, and that nothing befalls people unless it is in accordance with her decree. And he contrasts them with the Sadducees, who basically denied fate and said that everything depends on human free will, and the Pharisees, who took kind of a middle provision. They believed in fate or God's provision, but also thought that human choice, both of those things play a role. So the Essenes had a very strong deterministic theology. They believed that God had sovereign control over every single thing, and they taught that they had two predetermined groups. There were the sons of light, that was, of course, them, and there were sons of darkness, and that's everybody else. So just how the Calvinists have the elect and the reprobate, they had the sons of light and the sons of darkness, and God had decided that from the very beginning. And their writings, especially the Community Rule and the Thanksgiving Hymn, often speak about how God created people for specific destinies and gave them particular spirits, I guess, to fulfill those destinies. So the emphasis on divine foreordination and God's complete sovereignty sounds quite similar to classic Calvinist, aka Reformed theology, and especially the predestination and God's absolute control over history. So, enough about those people. The scrolls themselves, the very first scrolls, again, that the guy and maybe his brother or cousin found, they got these 7 nearly intact scrolls from Cave 1, and that's how all the scrolls are named after whatever cave they come out of. So it'd be like 1Q, meaning 1 would be the cave, first cave, Q would be QRAM, and then like some sort of number, and maybe like an identifier of some time. So if it was a hymn, maybe it'd have an H or something, but it might just be a random 57 after that. But anyhow, so all these came out of Cave 1. And the first, and maybe one of the most important, is the Great Isaiah Scroll. This is basically the entire book of Isaiah, almost perfectly preserved. And in the handout it shows, I think that's the one that's like 29 feet long or 24 feet long. Yeah, the 24 feet long was the Great Isaiah Scroll. And then there was also a second partial copy of Isaiah, and then there was the Community Rule, the main rule book for the Essene-like community. And then there was the Habakkuk Commentary. Now this is a Pesher-style interpretation of the prophet Habakkuk. So this wasn't like the book of Habakkuk. This was somebody's commentary on Habakkuk, explaining what things meant. And their Pesher style of interpretation would make it match whatever was happening to them right then. So it wouldn't look at the context of Habakkuk. It would be saying, this is what's going on right now, so this is what it means. So if we were doing it, it'd be like, oh, this guy is J.B. Pritzker, and this other guy is whatever his name is, and the other guy is this other guy. They'd fit it to the current situation. Of course, they believe they were in the end times, so I guess they didn't think there's anything else going to happen afterwards. There was the War Scroll. This describes the final battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. There's the Thanksgiving Hymns, a collection of poetic prayers. And then there was the Genesis Apocryphon. That's an Aramaic retelling of the stories of Genesis. Again, it's not the book of Genesis, and it's not Jubilees, but it's just basically a retelling of it. Maybe it's like, I don't know, the Message version of Genesis or something. But these 7 scrolls are what the Bedouins first pulled out, split up, and sold. They were eventually led scholars to the caves, then everything else came later. Now the scrolls were found mostly as tiny fragments, over 250,000 pieces that scholars had to painstakingly reconstruct.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's amazing, especially with advancements in technology, they're able to use like computers and that to and photographic type stuff to analyze it. And then I saw a video they were showing when they first did this, and this was back, I don't know, ages ago, probably the 80s, basically, based on that scanner. But anyhow, they would take it and look like this burnt-out copper where you couldn't see anything, and then they would scan it and then do stuff to it, and all of a sudden you'd see like all the text. And they're actually even able to tell where like 2 scrolls had kind of got mushed together, and they were able to say, okay, this is this scroll and this is that scroll, or at least the letters on it. Only a few scrolls, especially the Great Isaiah Scroll, were nearly complete. And again, they were there for all these thousands of years. So number 6, the scrolls were discovered mostly as tiny fragments. Over how many pieces that they had to painstakingly reconstruct?
250,000.
250,000, or tens of thousands, or over 15,000. Or really, since it says over, you could put 1. It was much more than that, but yeah, tons and tons of these little tiny fragments. So the collection breaks down into three main categories. There's biblical texts, and almost 40% of the entire group are books of the what we call the Old Testament. And almost every book of the Old Testament is represented except for Esther. Some books like Psalms, Deuteronomies, and Isaiah have dozens of copies. Now, I heard a theory that they said that Esther might not have been amongst them because of the fact that it was taken out and read like every time the Purim came about once a year. So it might have been kept someplace different, or it might not have been stowed away like that. And we do know also that Esther was a book that at one time, even like some of the Jewish scholars were like, is this really a Bible book or not? Since God's name's not mentioned in it. So that could be a thing too. But again, almost every single book of the Old Testament as we know it, or the Jewish scriptures as they would know it at that time, were found. But of course some of those are just fragments, so they can say, oh, this looks like from the book of Daniel, or this looks like, it's something from Leviticus. Now, there are also non-biblical Jewish writings, and that makes up 30% of the collection. Books like First Enoch and Jubilee were especially important to them. They had about 15 copies of Jubilees, and they treated it as highly authoritative scripture, not just a commentary. Again, they based their whole calendar and everything off of Enoch and Jubilees. And then there's also community documents. This makes another 30%. These were their own rules, like the community rule. There were hymns, there were the war plans, aka the war scroll, and also commentaries. So those are basically the three main categories of material that was found there. The three main categories of material, this is number 7, of the scrolls are biblical text, apocryphal / pseudepigraphical books.
Say that again?
Pseudepigraphical. I've been working on that. Those are fake books that were like attributed to somebody but clearly wasn't them. Kind of like the book of Enoch is that way. Clearly it wasn't Enoch, but it was written, much later, but they considered it to be his book. Anyhow, and also what kind of documents? Community, exactly. Community or a scene or sectarian would also work there. And the scrolls were written during the time between the First and Second Testaments, the Old and the New Testament, often called the Silent Years. And the vast majority were written in Hebrew, but quite a few were in Aramaic, and a small number were in Greek. There's even one scroll, or at least some scrolls, that are written in a special cryptic script that's still not fully understood. So while Hebrew dominates, it's actually a multilingual collection, which I guess kind of bolsters the idea that it was the Essenes, because they would have been pretty wise and would have known these languages. But this strange script, or some of the scrolls are written in a strange cryptic script that scholars haven't fully deciphered. The strange script is called the cryptic script, sometimes called cryptic A. Not very creative, these people, but coming up with their names. But it's a unique coded Hebrew alphabet that was invented by the Essenes. So instead of normal Hebrew letters, they made their own letters up. And then they have their own language, basically, that they wrote these documents in. So they created their own special symbols that only they'd be able to read. Out of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, only about 24 are written in this cryptic script. And again, scholars believe they're the most sensitive or secret writings, possibly special teachings or calendars only meant for certain members of the community. So even today, experts have only partially deciphered it, and many of those cryptic scrolls remain only partially understood. What the heck?
Smoke alarm again?
Did you get a new one? Is that a new one?
No, that one's over there. It might be the one in the closet, that monoxide detector. Although it's got new batteries, so it shouldn't. It should be fine. Or it could be the one in the hallway, which looks like to be the same model. So it would also
They
be.
got them at the same time.
Yeah.
Pass the table.
Anyhow. Now, question. That sounds like the hallway. So there's no New Testament writings found within all the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now I saw a post on Facebook recently that said, "Checkmate Christians, Jesus isn't mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls." which goes to show you the level of discourse you get on so-called social media. Most of the scrolls were written before the events of the New Testament. They were kept by a strict Jewish sect who separated themselves from everyone and especially shunned cities. You take a bat to it?
I will see if it's the one in the hallway when it goes off again.
Anyhow, the scrolls were hidden around 68 AD, right at the beginning of the Jewish revolt against Rome. Or at least some of the scrolls were. At that time, Christianity was still a very small movement, probably only a few decades old, of course. Jesus was 30-some when he died, so he only got a few decades to get to 68 there. So, New Testament books were still being written and circulated, so there simply weren't many copies available. And the community at Qumran also appears to have stayed separate from the early Christian movement. They kept separate from everybody. Now there is a tiny fragment called 7Q5. What's that mean? 7Q5?
The place Qumran. The cave
right.
that was found.
Right. Cave 7 in Qumran. And then also 5 was just like the 5th fragment they found, I guess, that day. I don't know. But it only has about 18 to 20 Greek letters on it, and just a few complete words or parts of words, and only one complete and unmistakable word, and that is the Greek like kai, which means and. So that's a very common word, as you might expect. So it would appear frequently in almost any Greek text, whether it's a shopping list or the Bible or a romance novel. It doesn't matter. It's going to be in everything. So there was a Spanish scholar back in 72 who claimed that it was from Mark 6:52 through 53, and a few other people later on supported him. But the mainstream scholarly view is that's very unlikely, it's very weak, because the fragment's so small and the letter rendering so uncertain that it would make it fit several different texts. And a lot of them consider it to be completely unidentifiable and possibly from like the Septuagint, the Greek copy of the Old Testament. Now, there is a very special scroll, which goes to your question earlier, Nancy, about what they're made out of. There is one scroll called the Copper Scroll, and it's very unusual. Anybody want to take a guess why?
Made out of copper.
Exactly. Unlike other scrolls written on animal skin or papyrus, I guess there's some papyrus also, this one was actually engraved on thin sheets of copper. And in fact, this copper scroll is pretty much unique. There's nothing like it in the entire ancient world. Here's why it's so unusual. Almost all ancient scrolls were written on animal skin or papyrus. Copper was never used for writing long text. Engraving a scroll on copper sheets was incredibly difficult and expensive. And this is the only metal scroll ever found from that time period. But because it was written on copper, it's also the only scroll from Qumran that survived in excellent condition. Of course, metal doesn't decay like other things, and so it's still in great shape today. And here's the crazy part about it. It lists 64 different locations where vast amounts of gold, silver, and temple treasures were supposedly buried. The amounts are enormous. Many scholars think the total would be over 60 tons of gold and silver. But the descriptions are extremely frustrating. They say things like, in the cave that is next to the spring on the third step, 42 talents of silver. Or in the dry well under the eastern corner. So it gives very vague landmarks, and they've likely changed over 2,000 years. So people have tried to look for it, but nobody's found. Yeah, nobody's found the treasure, because it's like getting
That's where all the movies come from.
Yeah.
All-Star and all that.
Yeah, and actually there's a book written by Joel C. Rosenberg. He wrote a fictional thriller called The Copper Scroll that uses the real Copper Scroll as kind of the starting point of the book. It's part of his Last Jihad series. But it's completely fictional. It just uses the scroll, the Copper Scroll, as a not a MacGuffin, but as something that kicks off the action. The Copper Scroll itself is kept in Amman, Jordan, not in Israel. It's on permanent display at the Jordan Museum in Amman. Because I guess originally when it was found, that part was actually part of Jordan. And so by whatever national or international finding stuff things.
Wherever it's found, that's where it stays.
Yeah, pretty much. It like belongs to them as part of their. So they have this on display there, I guess. I assume with other things as well. But of course, a lot of this stuff's probably in labs trying to be figured out what they are. But anyhow, how the scrolls affirm our Bible. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us tremendous confidence in the accuracy of our Bible, and mostly because of at least the most famous example is that great Isaiah scroll from Cave 1. It's nearly complete and dates to about 125 BC. When compared to the Masoretic text from 1,000 years later, it is about 95% identical. You guys remember what the Masoretic text was?
Pardon?
Remember what the Masoretic text was? We talked about that.
Was that were from the Hebrew?
Yeah, the Hebrew language was like starting to kind of disappear. They weren't using it so much, so some scholars decided they were going to like get the Bible written down in Hebrew, so that became the Masoretic text. And when they compared that to this thing from 125 BC, they found that even this stuff from 1,000 years later, it was still 95% identical. The differences are almost entirely spelling, grammar, or very small wording changes that do not affect the meaning. So, number 8. The most famous discovery from Cave 1 is the nearly complete which scroll? Isaiah, or the Great Isaiah Scroll. Right. Now, when compared...
Those were the checklist that you said when they go through they had like, does it do this, does it do that, does it do that? That's what determines if it's in the Bible.
Oh, the canon?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Well, no, this was more just the fact that, basic idea was before you got the printing press, people had to actually sit there and they had like one copy of, the script, the text here, and one there, and they would have to write down and you copy it by hand. And so the concern is that when you're doing that you're going to mess up and you're going to start doing, you get off on the line or something like that. But the fact that from 125 BC to like 100 or 1000 AD, it shows that the way that they copied it maintained accuracy that whole time. So we can be sure that the Bible that we have wasn't tampered with and messed with, to change things. It was, what it was back then, same as it is today. And so that's a common thing that, the Muslims will say that the Bible's been corrupted, it's been changed and all this.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, it's the same 125 BC as it is 1,000 years later, and also it is today. So it hasn't been changed since Muhammad supposedly wrote that it was a good book. Anywho, number 9. When compared to the Masoretic text from 1,000 years later, the Great Isaiah Scroll is about what percentage identical? 95%. Very good. Anyhow, the Dead Sea Scrolls are about 1,000 years older than the oldest Hebrew manuscript that had ever been discovered before that time. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, the oldest substantial Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament were dated from around the year 1000 AD. This is the great Masoretic codexes from the early Middle Ages. The Aleppo Codex from 920 to 930 AD, that's considered the most accurate and authoritative Masoretic manuscript, and the Leningrad Codex from 1008 to 1010 AD, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible in existence at the time, now housed in St. Petersburg. The oldest... What's that?
Where's St. Petersburg?
Russia, I believe. Yeah. So that's the Leningrad Codex, I guess. The oldest known fragment was the Nash Papyrus from the 2nd century BC. The Dead Sea Scrolls push our evidence back almost 1,000 years, giving us manuscripts from the time of the Maccabees and even earlier. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, written up to around AD 68, and the great Masoretic manuscripts from around AD 100 show remarkable agreement. This proves that Jewish scribes copied the scriptures with extreme care for nearly 1,000 years, from the time of the scrolls until the Middle Ages. And we can compare, of course, what we have today to then, so we can see how it kept being accurate. So, number 10. The agreement between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text from around AD 1000 shows that Jewish scribes copied the scriptures with remarkable care for nearly 1,000 years after the time of who?
You said Maccabees, but that ain't what you're talking about.
That's right. If it's 1000 AD, what happened? Jesus, right. The time of Jesus and the apostles
So,
was 1,000 years later. So you can put Jesus and the apostles, New Testament times, any of that kind of stuff would work. Now, you might have heard conspiracy theories about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Certain scholars or institutes were hiding parts of them, or that they contained shocking secrets about Jesus or the early Christianity. But the truth is that even though very early on, the decades after their discovery, there was a small team of scholars that had exclusive rights to study and publish the scrolls, the progress was very slow, and that led to a lot of suspicion. However, in the early 1990s, the scrolls were fully open to all scholars, and today almost everything has been published and is freely available. You can go online to the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library and view high-resolution photos of nearly every fragment. Research is very active, including new dating techniques and computer analysis. That was the thing that they did. They actually, I forget when that was, 80s? No, 2020. It was very recent. Somebody was talking to a friend about it. Somebody worked on, I guess, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he was talking about some of the problems they had, and the guy says, well, if it's written on animal skins, you can DNA check that. And so they did, and that's when they found that there was some cowhide in there, and it kind of showed that some of the stuff came from different places far away. Anyhow, and there's also there are still a few genuine scroll fragments in private collections, but the bigger problem today is modern forgeries. Many fragments that appear on the antiquities market since the early 2000s have turned out to be fakes. So while there is some legitimate frustration in the past, the idea that major secrets are still being suppressed is no longer credible. And people will take genuinely old manuscript or old parchment or old skins or whatever, and they'll forge stuff on there with aged ink and stuff like that. If you ever seen the show White Collar, it gets into that kind of stuff. He's doing that kind of stuff all the time, doing forgeries, and you got to get the old text, you got to get the old paper, old ink, old this, old that, old wax, whatever it might be. So anyhow, that's really the only concern right now is people getting forgeries, getting scammed, I guess. Anywho, the Dead Sea Scrolls are one of God's great gifts to us. They show that the Old Testament we read today is essentially the same text that Jesus and the apostles knew and used. So, and next week we'll hopefully look at those Bible manuscripts and how those were, what they mean, what it's about.
he'll save you a copy.
Save you a copy. Should probably, I guess, look at the handout here. Again, this is by Wesley Huff. He's a pretty bright guy, and he's there's a term for it. A guy who actually studies manuscripts and the text and stuff like that. Textualist or something. That too. But he actually, he'd be a guy who could actually make one of these fake things. He reproduces some manuscript, not of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but manuscript stuff. He'll actually reproduce them and give them as gifts to people. But anyhow, he has a lot of different things on his website, and this was one of them. You can see basically the documents has dating up there when they were from, the languages used. I'm not sure about the Nabatean, if that's what they call maybe that's a thing.
The cryptic one?
The cryptic one it might be, yeah. 970 plus scrolls. It has about 33 copies of Deuteronomy, 24 copies of Genesis, 20 copies of Isaiah. And here's the amazing thing, right? There's some that are longer. Longest is 29 feet. The smallest is no bigger than 3 inches. So that's how small these fragments are, and they're trying to piece them together. So they'll look at them, they'll try to compare where they're found at, of course, is a big hint, because you're not going to have different, scrolls out of different places. Where they're found at, they'll try to match the handwriting. They'll try to match the stuff it's written on, because of course handwriting, if they had scribes, they might write multiple multiple things. But they would try to piece stuff together and try to see, okay, can we put this together and figure out where this came from? So it's pretty wild. Again, they're not sure exactly 100% who wrote, copied, and stored all the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most people think it was these Essenes. But it could be other people as well. And he also has a list here showing all of the locations of the caves. Some near Qumran, and then others at different places in Gedi, Jericho, all around the Dead Sea area there.
Those numbers beside what, like, says Jericho and then cave 11, is that the number on the cave, or is that how many scrolls were found in that cave?
That's the number of the cave. Like cave 1 had at least 7 complete, scrolls. It had more in there as well, fragments and stuff. But yeah, see a sampling of other books found: Book of Enoch, Book of Jubilees, Book of Tobit, the Wisdom of Sirach, the War Scroll, the Rule of Blessings, Community Rules, and of course those go over these different types: the Deuterocanonical, aka Apocrypha, the Pseudepigraphica books, as well as just community books.
So when this kid found these, that's when everybody started looking.
Pretty much, yeah. He basically found them, him and his cousin.
There's all these areas along the sea with the caves.
Yeah. He found them and sold them, and then it was eventually got to actually reputable type people, and then they said, "Oh, where'd you find these at?" And then they, went and started finding more stuff, and then it became a big deal. And I guess they figure they found it all. I guess at this point, at least all they can, or at least 56, I think is when it said. Was when they 1947 to 1956, and now it's just been going through and trying to catalog. And again, you've got, of course he says 10,000 fragments or more than 10,000 fragments, but you've got all these fragments, some of them as big as little postage stamps, and you're trying to put them all together to figure out where they're from. And then the ones that were ruined, that now they've got new technology, they can try to read them without actually, destroying them, possibly. So there's all these things here to consider. And what else? And the copper scroll. Almost all the scrolls are parchment, with some being papyrus. One is made of copper. And it's such a crazy idea. You can see why people would want to write a book about that and use that as a catalyst thing. The scrolls contain almost all the Hebrew canon, which is the Old Testament, except for Esther. And again, maybe Esther is amongst the fragments they haven't got deciphered yet. But anywho, has anything in particular surprised you about the discovery story, or who hid the scrolls?
I never heard of them.
Never heard of the Essenes? Yeah, I hadn't either. It's so weird. I mean, you have these 3 groups that all came up at the same time. But I guess because they didn't want to be around anybody, because they didn't want to be impure. I guess their locations had all these. They had a certain word for them, basically baths, where they would bathe all the time, so they could be pure.
The purification.
Yeah, purification
part,
thing. Yeah, I guess they wore white, and to be part of the group, it took years to get into it, and you had to share at least some or all of your possessions. All became community possessions at that point. Somewhat like that, yeah. And then some were actually celibate, I guess, and other ones maybe had families. There's a lot of questions about it. But yeah, it's weird. They came up at the same time as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which, we hear about. But they were groups that you don't hear about them. But of course, they stayed away from people. They especially didn't go into cities because they're going to get impure. So they lived out by themselves. And they kind of had this weird, again, I guess there was some discussion. And one of the things I listened to about what makes a sect versus what makes a cult or something like that. And I don't know. Or maybe it's just what makes a different denomination, if you will, versus a sect, possibly is how it is. And the Sadducees and the Pharisees kind of had the same ideas, although the Sadducees seemed like they were pretty out there, rejecting resurrection, angels, all this sort of stuff, and just sticking with the first 5 books. Whereas the Pharisees had all this tradition stuff, but they were very different calendar. The the determinism thing that they had, the fact that they thought that certain people were, the children of light, the people were children
And
of
this
darkness.
is all found in the community writings?
I guess so,
like,
yeah.
Like the
I guess-
history, their history?
Yeah, I guess there might have been some other stuff, but not very much. And again, they didn't, there's not still, I don't guess, that's something I was going to look into, if there's still people who consider themselves Pharisees. Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, the community rules. They had various books like that, but that was one of the actual intact scrolls that they found in Cave 1. But yeah, that's something I was really interested in, about how the Essenes, and never haven't heard them before, but they were,
Right.
Kind of potentially the ones behind all of this. And, why do you think the Essenes valued the books like Jubilees and Enoch so highly? I found it kind of amazing, the fact that they were supposedly, very, very strict, and yet they considered these two books that everybody else considered just maybe good to read, but not actually scripture. They considered it as central as scripture. I found that very odd, but I don't know, for some reason they did. I think that one of the reasons, or at least you can see how they used it to do this year thing they did, this 364-day year, so that it was equal, always a week. So everything was, a 7-day period. How does the accuracy of the great Isaiah scroll affect your confidence in the Bible? Or does it?
It's 95%.
Yeah.
Pretty accurate over that many years.
Yeah. Maybe we'll get into that with the manuscripts, but I guess the difference between, you hear about textual variances between like one manuscript and another, but a lot of times it is stuff just like spelling, and spelling wasn't always such a big deal, which vindication for me, a bad speller. But as long as you could figure out what you're talking about, it wasn't like oh, you missed an I there. It's like, you know what I'm saying.
As long as they had the first and last letter right.
Yeah,
you
exactly.
figure the rest of it out.
Yeah, but a lot of the textual variances were very minor, like little things, or a different word that meant the same thing, just very slightly different changes.
Some of those words that are like 12 letters long could have been shortened so we could actually pronounce them.
Maybe, but you want the just mote, the just right word. I believe that is.
So if Jesus holds for another 2,000 years, we're in a lot of trouble, right?
What's that?
I said if Jesus holds for another 1,000, 2,000 years, we're in a lot of trouble, right?
Yeah.
With all of the translations and...
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be the weird thing now, to try to go back and do. Although it is interesting, you can probably look back at,
because I know that we, from every translation, we do go back to, goes back to the originals, to some extent, but the way they're worded, some of them, take a lot out, or it's like, it's not word for word, it's, thought for
Yeah.
thought, or just
you really have to, reverse engineer how you get to the words they used. And we'll see that maybe in a couple weeks if we talk about translations and that, about how that you have some that are really, really accurate, and some read really, really smoothly, and then some are just kind of like, well, here's what I think it says.
right. That's what I'm saying. So
scale.
if Jesus
So if you-
carries whenever they find our stuff.
If you have your book
they're gonna
and
be
you
in
say,
trouble.
okay, this is the NIV, and it's from this particular time, I'm going to say, well, they were concerned about this, and they used this, early manuscript, or this codex, as their basis. But while the ESV, they were trying to do this, and they used this as their basis. So, yeah, you kind of have to unravel it and go back to some original stuff there. We're out of time. Gotta get my watch right. It's a little bit slow. Any other questions? Yeah, I found the Essenes to be very fascinating and odd in their own way. Okey-doke. If nothing else, then we'll be dismissed here.
O Word of God incarnate, O wisdom from on high, O truth unchanged, unchanged.